Hello, friends, and welcome back to Page Two, and welcome to the Friday Conversation. I am here this week with Michael. And Michael, can you give us an introduction, please?
Well, my name is Michael Castleman. I've been an author for close to 50 years, and I've written 19 books, and my latest book is called The Untold Story of Books, and it is the first and only history of book publishing from an author's point of view. There are plenty of books that are about publishing, but virtually all of them are either memoirs of notable publishers or they are academic analyses of the book business. And the former, the memoirs, can be entertaining, but they don't really tell you that much about the book business. And the academic treatises are dry as the Sahara, and and they don't really tell you that much either. I mean, they're full of good numbers, and I've used those books, but I felt that what we needed was a look at the book business from the point of view of the little schnooks like me who write all the books. And there are really two different book businesses. There is the best-selling book business, and that there are about, in the United States, there are about 200 New York Times bestsellers every year, about 200. And those are the books that get all the press. You've heard of them. People are talking about them. You know, they get the media. And I wish them the best. Great. I'm glad that somebody's a best-selling author. But that's 200 books a year out of 2 million now published every year. So bestsellers are like, vanishingly small proportion of the books that are released every year. And all those books, the 1,999,080, don't get a lot of play. And there are all these authors who are extremely frustrated and confused because they think, well, how come I'm not getting all this media? What happened? How come I can't sell a book? And so that is why I decided to write The Untold Story of Books, to tell the actual story of how the book business evolved and what's happening today for all authors, the bestsellers, and everybody else like me.
Wow. So how did you ride that line between being dry as the Sahara and being entertaining and making it an engaging read for someone like me who knows next to nothing about publishing?
It was very important for me to have this book not be a dry academic tome. It was very important to me to have it be entertaining and engaging. And all I can say is that I've been a professional writer for close to 50 years. I know a thing or two about writing in an entertaining way. I've been a journalist,
Right.
And I've written all kinds of stuff. I've actually written comedy. So I set out to have a fast read, breezy book that would have a lot of information in it, but would also be an easy read, easy on the eyes, easy to get through, not too long. And then I had the manuscript edited extensively by both professional editors and by writer friends and editor friends who were very gracious with their time and helped me bring out the humor in the story. I mean, there's a lot about what happens in publishing that can be very depressing for authors. I mean, today in the 21st century, it's easier than ever to publish books, but harder than ever to promote and sell them. And so when people go through the pain of writing books and then seeing them published, it's very distressing when, they're greeted by thundering silence and no one seems to care. So I wanted to have a book that would reassure authors that number one, that they're not alone, that this is what happens to virtually everyone. and to talk about why this is the case. Why is it that it is so difficult for the 99.99% of authors to get any traction in the world? And that was the whole mission, and people are telling me that I've accomplished it, so I'm quite happy.
That has to be rewarding to write something like, for any book really, but to get that feedback that it's entertaining and packed with information. So score there.
Thank you.
Yeah. The how much of your own experience did you go back prior to when you began your journey as an author? And how far back did you go to the very beginning? And
I
how much
went
did
back
you insert your?
to I went back to pre-Gutenberg times. I went
Oh,
back
okay.
to I mean the book contains a tremendous amount of information about authorship in the 20th century and the 21st. But the story of books goes back to before Gutenberg, when books were written by scribes one at a time. And the whole arc of publishing as a business is that it has been always defined by and driven by the technological evolution of printing.
Hmm.
As printing evolved, fewer people could produce more copies of more books faster and cheaper per copy. And so initially, books were copied singly by hand, and that's where we get the Latin word manuscript, which means
Hmm.
written by hand. And those scribal written books cost the equivalent, today's equivalent of $75,000 a piece.
Wow.
And that is the current price of a Jewish Torah scroll. You know, and the Jewish
Mhm.
people have their foundational document, which is known as the Torah, which is written by scribes one at a time, copied by hand, and the process takes 1 year, and scribes charge $75,000. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, all of a sudden, fewer people could produce more copies of more books faster and cheaper per copy.
Hmm.
And so Gutenberg Bibles, when Gutenberg printed his seminal Bible, um, they sold at the time for today's equivalent of about $5,000 or $6,000,
Hmm.
which is a tremendous price break from 75,000, but it's still pretty damn expensive. And in fact, very few people could afford Gutenberg Bibles. And in fact, Gutenberg went bankrupt.
Hmm.
Gutenberg could not make it printing books, and he lost his presses. And so this shows that since day one of the publishing industry, it has been a minefield, and the graveyards are littered with dead publishers gone broke. Then, after Gutenberg, there were successive innovations in printing that slowly chipped away at the price. And so 300 years after Gutenberg, Benjamin Franklin was a printer in Philadelphia, and he printed books, and he sold them for today's equivalent of about $600 a piece. So that 600 bucks is a lot less than 75,000, and it's a lot less than 6,000, but it's still a bite, 600 bucks. And so books were not mass items, they were specialty items only for the rich.
Hmm.
And then what happened was that, again, successive innovations in printing, particularly, Gutenberg and Franklin, their printing presses were made entirely out of wood.
Hmm.
And wooden parts wore out pretty quickly, and they limited the amount of pressure you could apply. So the printing that they produced was not particularly crisp. But after around 1800, metal parts started getting introduced into printing presses that allowed them to produce better impressions, in other words, better quality printing, but also they could run faster without breaking. And
Hmm.
so, as metal printing presses, steel presses, started to become popular, and eventually, they took over because they were so much better. By the late 19th century, by after the Civil War, books had come down to today's equivalent of about $75 a piece. Again, now that's a big improvement over where it had been, but $75 is still pretty expensive, and uh, so a lot of people could not afford books.
Mhm.
What happened in the late 19th century, between 1900, well, actually between 1870 and World War I, high-speed industrial presses were introduced. And those presses could print thousands of books in the blink of an eye, and prices fell to the point where by around 1960, the typical hardback book cost just $25.
Mhm.
And that price held until the year 2000, when digital publishing happened. And with digital publishing, with ebooks, if you print ebooks, there's no printing at all.
Yeah.
And ebooks can, as I was saying, fewer people can produce more copies of more books cheaper per copy. Well, digital publishing takes that progression to its logical conclusion, because with digital publishing, one lone individual can publish an infinite number of ebooks for about $100 and distribute them worldwide virtually for free. So now, if you look at the Kindle store, lots of ebooks sell for less than $1.
Yeah.
And so this is the end product of fewer people producing more copies of more books cheaper than ever. And along the way, as books became cheaper, the good part about that was that more people could read, more people could afford to buy books, and more people did buy books and even dream about writing them and become authors like me. But the downside of digital publishing has been that an unprecedented glut of books. When I published my first book in 1980, American publishers released 45,000 books.
Mhm.
This year, American publishers and self-publishers will release 2 million books. 2 million. And so today, every new book that's released becomes the equivalent of a snowflake in Antarctica.
Yeah.
There's just so many books, it's very hard to get any notice at all.
So I guess another thing working against, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess the other thing working against the industry is the number of readers is also declining because more people are on their phones or social media or whatever else they're doing with their time. Are there less readers to read the 2 million books that are being published?
Actually, no.
Oh, really?
One of the fascinating things about the history of publishing is that every time a new communications medium has been introduced, people would go, "Oh my no, it's going to kill books. Reading is dead. Reading is doomed." So in the 1880s, when Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, there were articles in magazines saying, "Oh, reading is doomed. Everyone's going to throw out their books and just have record collections." In the early 1900s, when radio and movies were introduced, the exact same thing happened. People said, "Oh, books can't compete with radio and movies," but they did. And when television was introduced, "Oh, the people aren't going to read anymore," but they still did. And when the internet and social media and everything we have today, TikTok and whatnot, the guardians of culture always say, "Oh my God, reading is threatened. People aren't going to read." That turns out just not to be true. Americans buy 800 million books a year.
Wow.
And if you factor in borrowing from libraries, Americans read well over 1 billion books a year. Now, there's only 300 million Americans. I mean, that's like at least 3 books per person. So reading is not threatened. Reading
Mm.
is resilient. People like to read. People love to read. Now, not everybody reads.
Hmm.
And some guardians of culture bemoan that. Oh my God, only 40% of Americans read a book last year. Excuse me, but yeah, that I wish everybody were reading more because maybe I'd sell more books. But the fact is that reading is resilient. Nothing has ever killed reading and books, and in my humble opinion, nothing ever will.
Why will nothing kill reading?
Because people love to read. It's unbelievable. People love to read. I mean, I love to read. I've
Hmm.
loved to read my whole life. And like I said, not everybody reads
Right.
for pleasure, but those who do really love it.
Hmm.
And, and they have not stopped doing it when television came in, when the internet came in, with social media, cell phones, you name it. People spend hours a day on their phones and in front of their screens, and then they curl up at night with a good book because they love to read.
I'm 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 encouraged because I expected you to say that readership has gone down because I always see articles that are talking about how less Americans are reading and less people, even literacy is a problem with now with some of the younger generations. So
Yes,
yeah, I'm
there,
encouraged.
there are news articles that appear that, oh, reading at risk. In fact, there was a famous report that was released in 2004 called Reading at Risk that argued that people were not reading and that reading was declining and, the sky was falling. Um, I'm not going to deny the results of that report,
Hmm.
but I am going to say that the answers you get have a lot to do with how you ask the questions. And that's very clear from public opinion polling.
Hmm.
The fact is that for the last 20 years, since digital publishing has come in, Americans have bought between 800 and 900 million copies of books every year.
Hmm.
Libraries buy tons of books. And yes, the population is increasing faster than the number of books read is increasing. So there's been a slight decline in the chances of anybody reading a book. But when our nation is reading more than 1 billion books a year, I just don't see that as a crisis.
No, it doesn't. I'm so happy to hear you say that because I was expecting it to be dreadful news, and it's actually encouraging news that we're buying so many books because you do see it like you mentioned at the beginning about the seems like the celebrities and the memoirs of the that's where all the resources go into is the 20 or so books 50 or so books a year that get all the attention, and it seems like it's mostly celebrities and people who are well known that are kind of household names, like a Britney Spears memoir will fly off the shelves before it's released just because it's her memoir.
Right, right. The bestsellers get all the attention.
Hmm.
And that's nothing new. I mean, in all
Yeah.
the arts, that's the way it is. If you look at music, a tiny fraction of all the musicians and singers command the lion's share of all the attention and money. Actors, the same thing. A tiny group of people get all the juice.
Hmm.
And sports figures. I mean, millions of people play basketball all over the United States, and the NBA has 500 guys.
Yeah.
So, in all of the arts and all of human endeavor, there is a very cruel winnowing process that separates the stellar players from everybody else. And I wish it weren't that way. I wish that all authors got equal attention, but that's not the world we live in.
Yeah.
And so I have had to live my life as one of the little schnooks who works really hard every day and gets a little bit of attention here and there, but not much compared with best-selling authors, Stephen King, and
Mhm.
all the people whose famous authors whose names you know.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I wish it were different, but you have to live in the world that we live in.
That's true. So, how for someone who's been publishing, who's been writing for a while, and who's been publishing and doing the best work they can, how do you stand out in a business like this? How do you, because there's so many people promoting their work, that how do you stand out? How do you separate yourself?
Well, in fiction, this depends on what genre you write in.
Hmm.
So it's different in fiction and nonfiction. In
Okay.
fiction, the best way to stand out is to persevere and write series of books. And so, famous mystery writers often have the same character, the same detective solving serial mysteries.
Hmm.
Romance novelists, romance fiction that's aimed at women has always been the single biggest category of fiction. Women love romances, and romance writers, the way they get ahead is by writing serially, writing a lot of books,
Hmm.
and hoping that over time they get some traction. Now, on the nonfiction side, it's similar. That people who write over and over and over again in a field can often get a good reputation, and people will seek out their books. But also in nonfiction, current events plays a role. I mean, if you're writing about space exploration, and all of a sudden we land a guy on Mars, all of a sudden a lot of people are interested in space exploration and they go seek out those books.
Yeah.
But the sad fact of the matter is that in terms of getting attention for one's writing, there's an element of magic in it. It's unpredictable. I mean, you get a lucky break, you get an interview with somebody. I mean, I could have this interview with you. If somebody famous sees it and starts talking about it, then you and I both benefit from that. But uh, it's not predictable
Yeah.
who is going to do well and who's not. All you can do as an artist, as a writer, is do the best work you can possibly do and feel good about it and hope that somebody notices.
Before I started learning about the industry, I never realized how tough it is to be an author, because for someone like me who knew nothing about publishing, there's certain movies that portray authors as these kind of playboys, and they're rich, and they're like movie stars, but that's really very few and far between, someone that kind of reaches that level. So it's a
Yeah,
really tough gig. It's a really hard industry to be into.
all of the arts are very cruel that way,
Yeah.
and writing is no exception. I mean, I have a lot of writer friends, and we often joke that when non-writers talk about authors, there's always an adjective in front of it. It's always the famous author.
Yeah.
And we look at each other and think, famous? Are you kidding? Who's famous? I mean, I have a friend who's a best-selling author
Hmm.
who isn't famous. I mean, she can go to the grocery store and nobody recognizes her in a million years. So it people go into the arts because they love the arts,
Mhm.
but they also want to be rich and famous. And some people become rich and famous, but it's probably not going to happen to you. I mean, every week somebody wins $1 million in the lotto, but it doesn't happen to the vast majority of people. And if you count on fame and fortune, you are likely to be sorely disappointed and embittered. And my advice to everyone who's an aspiring writer is get yourself a good career, get yourself a good job that pays good money, because in the 21st century, writing books is much more likely to cost you money than make you any.
Yeah, even I have a few friends who are self-published authors who, I mean, I think for the cover, for editing, for all the other expenses, I know they end up what they're happy if they make their money back what they put into their book. So
Oh yeah,
it's
I mean,
tough.
Untold Story of Books. Um, I I wrote this book over 18 years.
Hmm.
And during that period of time, I hired 3 professional editors to edit that book at $2,500 a piece. So before this book was sold to a publisher, I was into it for $7,500 in editors and lots of other expenses. I had research expenses, I had travel expenses. I mean, I'm probably into this book for, $15,000.
Hmm.
Now, am I going to make that money back? Well, I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope
hopefully.
so, but I really don't know.
Hmm.
And people have to understand that writing books is not really a career. Writing books is an expensive hobby, very similar to playing golf or enjoying world travel or owning a boat or a horse. If you own a boat or a horse, you can love sailing, you can love riding, and some people make money at it.
Hmm.
But the vast majority of horse owners and boat owners don't. They pay, they don't earn.
One of another factor that I think about, well, that people I know who have self-published or who have queried their work with publishers, it sounds like such a soul-crushing experience to have so many people just pass on it, whether it's immediately, they didn't read it, or they take a read and they offer no feedback, which I'm sure they have 1,000 books to read. They can offer feedback for everyone, but that must be so tough to query something and to get all these rejections.
The Untold Story of Books was rejected by 25 publishers before one took it. And I've had that experience over and over and over again. Publishing books is it's like getting married. You can date a lot of people before you find the one. And so authors can date a lot of publishers, can pitch a lot of publishers, and they often just aren't interested for a million reasons,
Mhm.
and a million reasons, good, bad, and inexplicable. Um, so you have to have a tough skin
Mhm.
to be in any of the arts, and not just writing. I'm talking, acting, singing, being a musician, visual artist for sure. My son is a visual artist, and that's also a very tough way to go. And so, yes, the uh, some people have read The Untold Story of Books and said, "Oh, it's interesting, but it's so depressing." And what I say is, well, look, yes, it's tough, but what's really depressing is living a fantasy and not understanding the world you live in. So, The Untold Story of Books, I wrote it specifically to give people a realistic overview of the history of book publishing and the publishing business that it has created today. And it's not a pretty picture. It's not genteel. It's extremely competitive. It's tough out there,
Mhm.
but it's better to know that than to not know that. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think I know some authors who are very frustrated with not being able to make it a full-time job. I think I only know a handful who that supplement their income with their writing. It's very few that I know personally that can just, or that's all they do is write. So it's a really tough industry to be into, and I think it is better to know going into it, to temper your expectations, to not expect to be a famous author that you're going to be recognized in the grocery store when you go grab a carton of milk. So it's better to know that going into, because you will be disappointed if you go in thinking that.
Right. It's difficult. And of course, anything worth doing is difficult. It's not easy to have a podcast. It's not easy it's not easy to have any job.
Mm-hmm.
But very few people make a living from writing books. In fact, no American author who you read in high school made a living writing books. Herman Melville, Moby Dick, Walt Whitman, Louisa May Alcott, James Fenimore Cooper, Henry David Thoreau. None of them, not one of them, made a living from writing. They all had other jobs. They all had other jobs, and they wrote part-time on their own time. And that's the way it is today. I mean, I made a living for 35 years as a magazine writer. So I was very interested in making a living as a writer. And in the late 20th century, you could do that writing for magazines, and I did. Mm-hmm. And on the side, I also wrote some books because magazine articles, and the two careers dovetailed nicely, because magazine articles often led to book proposals that led to books. And then when I wrote the book, I would send it out to editors and pitch magazine articles based on the book. So there was a nice symbiosis there. But like I said, writing books is not really a career unless you're Stephen King or John Grisham or Colleen Hoover. There are probably, like I said, there's 2 million authors in the United States every year. I'm guessing that's no more than 1,000 or 2 make a living from it.
Yeah, that was my next question, actually, because I was trying to figure out how many authors out of that 2 million actually just write. That's all they do. It's got to be, yeah.
Well, I don't know. There's no research on that, but I can tell you this, that a lot of people think that writers make their money from the book advance. An advance is a sum that publishers pay you before you've written the book. Mm-hmm. You write a proposal, they buy the proposal, and they say, okay, here's X amount of money to write the book. And in the late 20th century, most authors got advances. They were small. They weren't a whole lot of money, and you couldn't live on them, but you got some money up front. Today, out of the 2 million books published every year, the best estimate I've seen is that maybe 10,000 get advances. That's 0.5% of all the books. That means that 99.95% of authors did not get an advance. And I have to say, for the Untold Story of Books, I didn't get an advance. Mm-hmm. I got 0. Now, in the late 20th century, I wrote a dozen books. From 1980, I wrote my first book in 1980. From 1980 to the year 2000, I wrote a dozen books in those 20 years, and my advances averaged about $25,000. Now, that's good money, but I couldn't support my family on that.
Right.
So it was supplemental. Since 2000, with the advent of digital publishing and the absolute avalanche, tsunami, Niagara Falls of books that we're living with now, very few authors get advances. Very few authors make any money. And, writing books is much more of a labor of love than it's ever been. And fortunately, I love to do it. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to have a labor of love. I wrote a book in 2021. I had a book come out. I got an advance of $2,000 for that book. It took me 3 years to write that book for $2,000. But that was a lot better than the Untold Story, because that got a 0 advance. But the thing is, an advance is not a gift. An advance is not a grant. An advance is a loan. Mm-hmm. the publisher advances authors money that has to be repaid from the earnings of the book. And a lot of books don't, quote unquote, earn out. In other words, they don't repay their advances. And that pains publishers horribly,
Yeah.
and has bankrupted some. But if you don't get an advance, there's nothing to pay off. And so you make money from the first copy sold. So with Untold Story of Books, I didn't get an advance, but a couple months from now, I'm going to get a check because it's selling
Yeah.
and the publisher's going to pay me. And so, I don't know how much I'm going to make, but I hope a lot. We'll see.
Oh, hopefully. Yeah. So if there, okay, so there's more people reading, there's more books being published, there's more people buying books. Why aren't there more advances than just the select few that we talked about?
Because sales per title have plummeted.
Hmm.
You have to understand that in the late 20th century, most books sold at least 1,000 copies, and so figure a royalty rate of 10% and a cover price of $25. So that means if you sold a book, the author got $2.50, and if it sold 1,000 copies, the author got $25,000.
Hmm.
Well, in the 21st century, the royalty rate is the same, but sales of books have plummeted because there's just so many of them. And so today, 80% of books sell fewer than 100 copies.
Wow.
And yeah, you have to really think about that. That means 4 out of 5 books do not sell 100 copies, and only 6% of books sell 1,000 copies today.
Hmm.
The book glut has decimated sales per title. So while Americans are still buying in aggregate about the same number of books, sales per title have plummeted, and as a result, publishers' incomes have fallen, and they can't afford to give advances anymore. So they don't.
Hmm.
And a lot of self-published books, when self-publishing first started, publishers thought, self-published books, they're going to be trash. No one's going to read them. No one's going to buy them. So figure that there's about a million 1.5 million self-published books per year. Say they sell 100 copies each. Okay, so that's 150 million books that are sold that are self-published. Well, that cuts in pretty deep into the 800 million that Americans buy. And so the more books that are self-published, even if each one of them only sells a few copies, add up all the copies that they sell, and publishers are freaking out
Hmm.
that they're just not making any money. And so that's why advances have tanked, and that is why publishers continue to merge their businesses in an effort to save money on things like personnel and sales force and warehousing, and because they're up against the wall. So, like I've been saying this whole conversation, it is tough out there for everybody. It's tough for authors, agents, publishers, booksellers. Anybody in this business is really challenged.
Yeah, I always wondered if, well, my question's already, you already answered my question, but I wonder if, because there's a lot of bad books out there. I think we can all agree. There's some really fantastic self-published books that I've read that I really loved, really great stuff. But there's a lot of bad books out there. Is that a net negative for? It sounds like it is
Well,
for the glut.
yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of really bad books out there, books that are the literary equivalent of fingernails on a blackboard. And the problem really is that a lot of self-published books are not edited well.
Right.
So the thing is, you know, publishers will say self-published books are trash. Well, that's not true. Plenty of self-published books are really good. And
Hmm.
plenty of books released by major publishers aren't very good.
Yeah.
What really separates the sheep from the goats is whether or not the book has been extensively edited. Like I said, I hired 3 different editors for a lot of money to go through the Untold Story of Books. And smart authors get their work edited before it goes to the publisher, because editing is what makes books shine. It's
Right.
what polishes them. And I've heard many, many people say, oh, well, I'm an experienced writer, I don't need to be edited. That is absolute nonsense. The better writer you are, the more you need editing, because if you're a good writer, someone who's less than a good editor may not catch minor flaws that you want caught. And so the real issue is not who publishes books, but how extensively they've been edited. And in the Untold Story of Books, I urge authors and aspiring authors to have their books edited by at least one editor, hopefully a lot more. Like I said, I had 3 editors on the Untold Story of Books, and I had another 50 people read that book. So it takes a village to write a book. And a lot of people think that writing is a solitary occupation. Yes, composition writing is solitary, but before you go to market, you better make sure that you have a whole lot of people reading that thing and commenting and pushing you to do better. Otherwise, no one's going to read it down the road.
Hmm. I always wondered too that for someone like Stephen King, if he's not contractually obligated to use a publisher, why doesn't someone like Stephen King self-publish?
Excellent question. And that question has been giving major publishers migraine headaches for years. They go to bed every night worried that their top authors are going to pull out and self-publish. And they could.
Hmm.
It's not that difficult. If you're Stephen King, bookstores are going to take your books, distributors are going to distribute it, the media is going to cover your releases. So why don't they self-publish? Mainly because publishing books is a hassle. It's very difficult to be a publisher. And if you doubt that, then I invite you to publish a book, self-publish a book, and try and sell it. And you will see very quickly how hard, how impossible it is to publish books and make money at it. So Stephen King and James Patterson and John Grisham, they could self-publish, but why bother? They have big publishers who have locked them into multi-book contracts for millions of dollars. That looks a lot better than being a grubby little self-publisher trying to flog your titles. I mean, if I were a famous author, I wouldn't self-publish.
Hmm.
Why do that? I'd glom onto some publisher and they would pay me a fortune and we'd all be happy. But as you were saying, the real famous authors really don't need publishers. They're a sort of vestigial convenience, but they are convenient, and that's why all the famous authors don't self-publish.
So on the self-publishing topic, I also wonder. So Amazon does a lot of the like Amazon KDP is huge. Why doesn't considering the amount of books that are sold every year, why doesn't another company create a self-publishing arm and have another avenue for authors who want to self-publish, even if it's digital only? They can avoid printing books, just digital publishing only. Why doesn't someone else throw their hat in the ring for that?
They have. There
Oh,
are hundreds of little companies that are known as hybrid publishers or publishing services companies. These are companies that are set up to publish books, They can edit them, they can design them, they can get you an ISBN number, they can do everything. They can, some of them even have relationships with book distributors. So
Hmm.
these companies are set up to help authors publish, and authors pay them. Just like but in the 19th, before the 19th century, there were no publishers, and if you wanted to publish a book, you paid a printer. You hired a
Right.
printer, you gave them a manuscript, you said print this, and they did, and then you were left to market it yourself. Well, today, those printers have been replaced by hybrid companies, also known as publishing services companies, and they're happy. They're happy to publish your book. They're delighted to publish your book. And in fact, if you call one of them up and say, I'm thinking of publishing a book, you can expect that they're going to harass you with emails and phone calls for the next 6 months trying to get your business.
Wow.
So instead of having a publisher reject you and say the classic line, your manuscript does not meet our needs at this time, instead of hearing that, your phone doesn't stop ringing, and every time you pick it up, it's, oh, are you sure you want to? How about publishing that book you were talking about? So, uh, publishing services companies do
Hmm.
help people publish, and some of them actually can get books a little bit of attention, not much, but some. And a lot of people use publishing services companies, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Hmm.
And so it's one of the options out there. If a big five publisher, when I do a lot of speaking to aspiring authors, and what I say to them is, if you have an edited book manuscript or a good book proposal, by all means, try and get an agent and start out pitching it to the big five publishing companies, because maybe they'll give you a nice advance. But if they don't, there are hundreds of independent publishers out there to go to that are generally called small presses.
Right.
And it was a small press that published Untold Story of Books. And beyond that, there are all kinds of uh, publishing services companies that are publishers for hire that'll print your book. So start at the top and work your way down, and eventually you'll find a way to publish that work.
Hmm. I've heard a lot of horror stories about small presses, about ones that you have you sign a contract and they're not always on the up and up, and you end up in this contractual where they keep delaying it, or they have some kind of problem where the editing isn't good, or the cover they choose isn't up to par. So it is a little scary to know which direction to go in for a small press, because a lot of them seem to not last that long.
That's right. I Early in the 21st century, I wrote a 3-volume mystery series. Mystery books, and I had 3 of them. And in every case, they were all published by different small presses.
Hmm.
And the reason why they were published by different small presses was that as soon as they published my book, within 6 months, they were out of business.
Yeah.
They're going broke. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's very difficult to run a publishing company. And the main asset that any publishing company has is its backlist. The backlist is the collection of books that they've printed that are at least a year old. And those books, some of them sink and don't sell any, but backlist titles often sell very well. So, for example, think of a famous book like Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, or Moby Dick.
Hmm.
Well, they sell steadily, and backlist titles sell steadily and bring steady money into publishers, and backlist titles account for 2/3 of all book sales, and backlist titles are what keep most publishers in business.
Wow.
Because the front list, the recent releases is called the front list.
Hmm.
Front list, you can't count on that stuff selling. Maybe it doesn't sell. Maybe you're risking money and you lose money. But that's okay. If you have a big backlist, you're going to keep the lights on. But if you're a small press and you haven't published many books, well, you don't have a backlist. And if you don't have a backlist, you have no backstop. You have nothing you can turn to produce revenue that's going to keep you in business.
Hmm.
And so small presses are like restaurants. 90% of them fold pretty quickly.
Yeah. It's scary out there for authors.
It is.
It is. I also we talked before we started recording about copyright because I've heard very wildly different explanation or definitions and explanations of what copyright is and what it can mean. Some people are very cautious when it comes to copyright, and there's certain things you have to. For example, we have a forum that we have a little community, and there's some authors who did like a writer's battleground, who they would write stories, and there was judges who would judge their stories, and it was just for fun. But as a precaution, we had to. One of our authors suggested that we have a kind of a notice in every story that says this is the property of the author. It doesn't belong to anyone else, just to prevent any copyright issues. But then I also hear that copyright is an illusion, that it doesn't exist. So what's the deal with copyright? Can you help us with it?
Basically, copyright is an illusion. Now, copyright was invented to protect intellectual property. And so my books should be mine,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they are until someone steals them.
Yeah.
Copyright is an ideal. It's a nice idea, and there have been cases where authors did succeed in suing people who stole their intellectual property. And I did that once. I had another author once stole a book of mine, plagiarized it, took my book, put her name on the cover, and sold it to a publisher.
Wow.
And by accident, I found out about that, and I went after her, and I collected. But I found out about that totally by accident. She came within inches of getting away with it, of stealing my book, and no one ever knowing. It was just a bizarre series of coincidences where a friend of mine saw her book and knew that I had written a book in the same subject and said, "Mike, you want to see this other book?" And I said, "Sure." And my friend sent me the book, and I opened it up, and I thought, "Oh my God, this is my book!"
That's wow. What an experience that must have been.
So, and today, copyright is even more of an illusion thanks to artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence is all over the news and is being presented as this blue sky, wonderful thing that's going to make all of our lives easier. I don't know about that, but I can tell you for certain that artificial intelligence is misnamed. It should be called plagiarism software,
Mm-hmm.
because artificial intelligence is based on what's known as a large language model, which takes enormous billions of words and trains computers to use those words in human-like ways. Well, where do those companies get the billions of words? They get them by stealing people's books. And lawsuits have been filed, and the large language model that is owned by Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and Meta were sued and were forced to reveal the titles of the books they had absorbed and digested to create their large language model. And guess what? 3 of those books were written by me.
Really?
They stole 3 of my books. And I know, and they've stole, thousands and thousands of books have been stolen by authors. Have we collected one dime from any of these schmucks? No, we haven't. Now, there are lawsuits have been filed. The Authors Guild has a huge lawsuit against the large language model companies. But, I am not holding my breath to cash checks from these schmucks. These guys are crooks, and they are going to do everything. And they're also rich.
Yeah.
So when a bunch of little authors go up against Facebook, I mean, they can hang us up in court for 10 years. But the fact is that they have violated our copyrights, they have stolen our intellectual property. And so you're left with a question of, well, what to do? You could
Yeah.
protest by not ever writing anything again. But I don't want to do that. I love to write. I'm a writer. I write. I get up in the morning. I love to write. So I'm going to keep writing. And that means that my work is virtually certain to keep being stolen. And it's not even the large language models. If you go on the internet, there are pirate book sites that steal people's books and then sell them. And some of my books have been pirated and are available on pirate websites. Do I see a dime for those sales? I do not. So again, they've been sued, but it's like a game of whack-a-mole. Once you win against a pirate site, and there have been many victories, authors groups have put several pirate book sites out of business. But the criminals who own those sites just put the books back up there under a new name, a new URL, and they're back in business. And then you have to sue them again. So copyright is a wonderful ideal that in reality basically does not exist.
Well, that's depressing. What was what ran through your mind when you received the book and you started reading it and realized it was your book? That
I was shocked. I have to say, I when I realized, I read the first page and I thought, oh, this is interesting. I read the second page. I thought, wait a minute, this sounds kind of familiar. And then the book that I had written on page 3 had a little joke. And I get to page 3 of the stolen book. There's the same joke. And I thought, oh my God, this is my book. And I quickly paged through it. I realized this is my book with her name on it and a different title. And I set it down and I just started stamping around the house thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I told my wife, take a look at this. Take a look at this. And, but fortunately, this thief, her bio said where she lived, in what town, and it also identified her agent. Oh. And so I found out her agent's address, and I found out her address, and then I wrote them a letter saying, I caught you red-handed, and I'm going to sue the crap out of you unless you offer me a generous settlement, and you have 48 hours. And they offered a settlement. It wasn't super generous, but I insisted that they send me a copy of the contract she had signed so that I could see how much of an advance she got. And she had gotten $2,500. And I said, okay, send me $2,500. And the agent came back saying, oh, boo hoo hoo, she can barely pay her rent. She's poor. She's hurt. She's this, she's that, And I have to say, I have a soft spot in my heart for authors, even when they are mendacious thieves. And so I settled for half the amount, and they paid me $1,250. And credit. And I insisted that they add my name to the cover, which they did. So, but like I said, I discovered that instance of wholesale plagiarism totally by accident. And there's even a website. There's so much plagiarism today that there's even a website called Plagiarism Today. If you want to keep up with who's plagiarizing who, you can on the internet.
Wow. So you were able to locate her through her bio and her agent. But if today somebody copied and pasted your book and posted it on KDP, self-published it, change the title, there would really be, I mean, the odds of you finding out would be, I would guess, slim to none.
Correct. Yes. And there's a tremendous amount of, well, it is possible to find piracy on KDP because there
Hmm.
are software programs that are text analysis. So you feed your book into a text analysis program, and then you can run it up against ebooks that you buy on KDP, and you can identify, and the program can find books that are a lot like yours, and
Hmm.
then you can decide if they've been stolen. But if you find that, for one thing, finding that is time consuming and very expensive. And once you find it, all you can do is go to Amazon and say, take this book down. It's not like you're going to recover money.
Right.
And so for a working author who's got a job and is trying to support themselves, is it worth it? Not really. Unless you're rich, unless you're Stephen King, it's just not worth it. And authors just have to live with the fact that digital publishing is a knife in the back a lot of times.
Wow. Jeez. Yeah. It's wow. Yeah. I would just imagine opening the book and finding your book with someone else's name on it. Must have been a surreal. I mean, I couldn't even imagine what that would be like.
Yeah, it was strange, but it was all part of my exploration about what it's really like to be an author, and sometimes you learn with a slap in the face.
Yeah. That's. I think that can be said for a lot of things in life. You learn with a slap in the face.
Right.
Unfortunately, yeah. The time has flown by, and I just didn't realize what time it was, but it's completely flown by. Um, there was a question that I like to ask all of my guests, and that is, what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience that's stuck with you through your life?
My first job was a dishwasher in a restaurant. And I learned from that job that I never wanted to work in a restaurant ever again, and that I was going to do something else because I realized I just was not cut out for that. I didn't want to do that. And I thought, oh my God, if I don't really make something of myself, I could wind up stuck being a dishwasher, and I don't want to do that. So that was my experience.
Oh, yeah, nothing like a bad job to motivate you, right?
Right. And it did.
Yeah. Michael, thank you so much. I know you're very busy. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for spending an hour of your day with me.
Well, thanks for having me on, Steve. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you and your audience enjoy The Untold Story of Books, which is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. And I hope that anyone who wants to write and who wants to be an author, I encourage you to do it. It's not the road to fame and fortune, but if you love it, you're going to love it.
Well said. Even after all the bad news, I think that's a good way to finish it off. Where can people find you? Do you have a website?
Yes, mcastleman.com, mcastleman.com. And you can contact me through that. And I hope to hear from you.
Awesome. And I'll put all those links down in the description below for the podcast. So be sure and check it out and go buy the book and learn more about the history of books.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.